Webinar. Today's webinar will concern forms and submissions. I am Randall Mullen with TDA Consulting, and I will further introduce myself and the co-presenter momentarily. Before we begin, though, I first want to cover a few logistics. If you participated in prior CPF cohort webinars, you probably know this detail. All participants will be muted during the webinar, so you will participate in so-called listen mode. The PowerPoint presentation has either already been provided to you or it will be available to all participants. The slide deck will also be posted on the HUD Exchange soon after this webinar. You will find the slides on the recently launched CPF cohort landing page shown here. On the lower right side, you would click on FY 2023 cohort, of which your cohort is a part. Although you will participate in listen mode, we still want you to become actively engaged. You may submit content-related questions using the chat feature in Zoom. Sending those questions, please, to everyone. The co-presenter and I will monitor the chat and answer clarifying questions when possible as they're asked during the presentations. We'll also pause at the end of each section in today's webinar, read aloud those frequently asked questions, and orally answer them for all to hear. As in the prior webinars, we reserve time for a Q&A period toward the end of the presentation, where we'll invite any HUD representatives that we have with us to answer the more difficult questions or clarify what we presenters have provided in our earlier responses, as that may be necessary. Here's the agenda that we'll follow today. As I mentioned, it will begin with introductions, followed by a brief review of the prior cohort webinars, and then we'll begin our presentation on today's topic of forms and submission. After we cover those agenda items, we'll have a final question and answer period and identify resources that are available on the HUD Exchange to further guide your preparation of the forms and submission of them as part of your grant packet to HUD. And lastly, we'll invite you to complete that evaluation, either before you even end participation or immediately afterwards. Now, I'll begin introductions and then tag my co-presenter, who will introduce herself, and she will in turn tag any HUD representatives we have joining us today. Again, I'm Randall Mullen with TDA Consulting, where I've worked for many years as both vice president and as senior consultant on a wide range of housing and community development projects. And I've recently assisted HUD in explaining guidance around special congressional appropriations. That work has included both recovery from natural disasters and response to the COVID-19 pandemic, plus recovery from its associated economic impacts, and now the CPF program. The co-presenter today is Jennifer Alpha. Jennifer, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everyone. Welcome to today's cohort session. My name is Jennifer Alpha. I'm a senior consultant with TDA. I work on a range of HUD programs, CPF, of course, including, and also home, CDBG, CDBG-DR, NSP. I do a lot of planning work as well. My former career, I was an attorney, so I do have a special love for a good form. So I'm glad to be with you here today. And let's see, we can turn it over to some HUD folks.
Connor has joined us.
Great.
Yeah,
Connor, would you like to say hello?
Hey everyone, my name is Connor LaRoe. I'm a program analyst with the Congressional Grants Division. So I work on technical assistance programs for CPF grantees, like the cohorts that you're on right now. And I also serve as a systems officer, assisting some of your grant officers with DRGR related issues that grantees may be having. And I don't see any other grant officers on in the participants yet, but if there are any, please feel free to unmute yourself and introduce yourself. But if not, they may join later, and then we can just move forward with the presentation.
Okay, hearing that none has unmuted himself or herself, will continue. And Connor, if you do see one join us, perhaps we can pause and allow that person to introduce himself or herself. The CPF cohort is assembled for you to receive specific guidance that will assist you in the satisfactory completion of your grant materials. You were invited to join this cohort based on your award of a fiscal year 23 CPF grant. To facilitate and support this cohort, you're enrolled in a learning management system called Absorb, which is hosted by TDA Consulting. Previous sessions held on the date shown here covered the requirements for submission of those grant materials, beginning with the project narrative, that is what must be described in a full project description, a budget, how to itemize not only the planned uses of your grant, but also identify sources of other funding for the entire project. And third, environmental review, when and how to assess the impacts of your project on the surrounding environment and vice versa. Today's session 4 on forms and submission will specifically assist you with completion and submission of those required forms and the related content necessary for you to finally enter into a grant agreement and start your community's project. To obtain valuable resources on the prior webinar slides, we do urge you again to check out the CPF program landing page. If you haven't signed up for the HUD Exchange listserv to obtain updates, we urge you to do so. And you'll want to add the CPF program to your notifications. And then, of course, you'll be notified about the new information that is posted to the HUD Exchange on the CPF program. Jennifer is going to place into the chat a link for the listserv, and I'm going to actually now show you specific instructions that will apply to the occasion where you will want to add the CPF program to your notifications. What you will see now on the screen is the page where you subscribe to HUD Exchange mailing lists, and it is a long list. I want to point out that the items are in alphabetical order by the program name, and you have to recognize that the CPF funding grants are actually part of an existing HUD initiative called the Economic Development Initiative, or EDI. So you will check off EDI-CPF for community project funding grants. Now going back to the presentation. What specifically will the forms topic cover, and how will Jennifer and I address it? Well, once again, we'll explain guidance based on the FY23 CPF grant guide, just like we did for the grant materials on the other topics of narrative, budget, and environmental review. The required forms for submission of your grant packet are described in the so-called attachments part of the grant guide. Jennifer and I will detail key forms and instructions, beginning with the standard Form 424, or application for federal assistance, followed by other required forms, and then we'll wrap up with the grantee submission checklist. But first, it's time for a poll, which Jennifer will conduct. Jennifer?
Thank you for that, Randall. Yeah, so we're going to launch a poll. Just a little get to know you poll. You'll see it pop up on your screen. So the question we have for you first is, have you begun to complete the forms for your CPF submission? And this will help us understand where you're at in the process to better know whether folks have an understanding of what the forms are about, or if these are new concepts and new information for everyone. So folks timing in, thanks for doing that. And give you a few more seconds. Doesn't look like everyone's responded, but it looks like things have pretty much stopped. So we'll give you another second or two, and then we'll close this poll. All right, so I share the results, and it looks like about 70% of folks have not started their forms yet, which
Yes.
is understandable, and it's good you're here because we're going to walk you through all the forms and how you complete them. So you'll have a good understanding once you do get started. But for those of you who have started, perhaps you have some questions that you want to share with us, and you want to just drop those into the chat, and then we'll answer them as we go along. And we have one more poll to share. We'll get that launched.
We call this the follow-up question.
Yes, follow-up question. All right, so for this question, we'd like to know when you expect to submit your grant materials. So the whole cohort was designed to prepare you to submit these materials. Everyone's anxious to get these projects started, both locally and at HUD. So we'd like to understand, when might HUD expect these grant materials now that you've gone through all the cohort sessions, or you will have by the end of today, and you can have a good understanding of what's required. So do you expect to submit within 2 weeks, within 1 month, within 2 months, within 3 months, or do you think it will take you longer than 3 months? All right, got good responses on this one. Lots of folks participating. Thank you for that. Going to end the poll. And we'll see that the majority of folks are looking like they're gonna, it's actually pretty evenly split between 1, 2, and 3 months. So it looks like folks do need a little more time. They're not exactly ready to go, but within a month, about 10 folks, within 2 months, another 11, and then within 3 months, another 12. So I'm glad you have this on your horizon. Definitely keep your eye on the prize and keep moving. It's easy to get sidetracked. So hopefully you'll get those materials in within this time frame that you've indicated. Thank you for that. All right. And with that, we will stop sharing the results and move back on to the slides.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, that was very interesting information. As I mentioned, the key forms will begin with the standard Form 424, or the application for federal assistance. Those of you who represent grantees that receive other HUD funding are probably familiar with this standard application. Other grantees are encountering it for the first time. As Jennifer noted in the poll results, we are eager to share this information with you so that you will be able to use it in conjunction with the CPF program, as there will be specific instructions that may modify what you're familiar with doing ordinarily. The SF 424 application for federal assistance is the common application for organizations to receive funding from either HUD or the other departments. And it does provide the basic information about your organization as a grantee, which is requested funds be made available by a special congressional appropriation. And that's where the instructions become a little different than they might be for common use. As such, your organization, which has already received the funding, is viewed as an applicant, and you must carefully identify and describe your organization along with your planned community project and its funding source or sources. Now, how can you obtain the SF 424 application for federal assistance? Well, first, you want to refer to the FY23 grant guide and turn to page 11 as shown on this slide. As I'll demonstrate, you may use the link in the first paragraph that you see on this screenshot, which offers you a landing page at the HUD Exchange, which is then linked to grants.gov. And as I will demonstrate, that link will take you to the place where you can then obtain a wide variety of forms, including the SF 424. And as these instructions indicate, you will select forms and then SF 424 family. I'll explain why that term is used, and then download the application for federal assistance. So allow me to stop sharing the presentation now, and I will go to grants.gov, and we'll take a look together at what you will need to do. Okay, this shows you the page where you can pull down on forms here and select SF424 family, which I've already selected over here on the left side. You can see that particular subpart of this website identified. And don't let that term family throw you. It's actually referring to a grouping of grants associated with a particular function of the federal government. And this family of programs covers, of course, those that impact communities. And as such, there are numerous agencies involved. This first column is organized in such a way where you might need to click it, as I already have, so that it is in an alphabetical order. And then you can scroll down and find the application for federal assistance right here. And you will note that it is possible to download not only, of course, the form, but also the form's instructions here. And this requires, of course, that you do use Acrobat Reader to look at the form, and we recommend that you use Adobe Acrobat in order to complete the form. Now we'll go back to the presentation. And I'll recap what I just did for your benefit, and then emphasize how this will connect to the specific instructions that I referenced will apply to the CPF program as indicated in the grant guide. Again, you'll download the form, download it together with its instructions, but recognize that those instructions are not the last word. You will have to note those instructions that appear in the desk guide on page 12, which I will advance the slide to and show you momentarily. But before I do so, I do want to point out certain issues that have arisen when we understand grantees have attempted to obtain these forms. If you work in a large scale organization, perhaps either a local government or a state government, it may be that you would have difficulty downloading these forms, in which case you'll have to add permission for downloading the files. And then, of course, you would need to add Adobe Acrobat if you've not already done so to your computer. Okay, we'll now turn our attention to completing the form. Once your computer has downloaded the SF424 application for federal assistance, you can complete it in a fillable manner using Adobe Acrobat. Again, you must follow the specific instructions in conjunction with the more general instructions. And those instructions, as I indicated earlier, begin on page 12. They continue through to page 13. And you will find that there are also references in those instructions where, yes, there are still other forms to be obtained and used for your submission in conjunction with the standard form 424. I will refer later to box number 21. But before I do so, I want to share the form with you and call attention to not only box 21, but those key boxes that are central to the submission of a grant packet will be promptly reviewed, approved, and then you can enter into a grant agreement. So I'm going to switch screens yet again, and we'll look together at the SF 424. And particularly concentrate on boxes 8, 15, and 21. Allow me to make this a little bigger for you to see. Zooming in on box 8, it is the box covering applicant information, and that is where you want to include the legal name of your organization, its unique identifying information, as well as its address. I'll have more on each of those items in just a moment, but this is one of the 3 most important parts of this form. Also, box 15, I'll scroll now to that particular box, refers to the descriptive title of the applicant's project. However, you know that there is space here for more than just the simple title, and there is also reference to adding attachments with instructions in the common application form that says, attach supporting documents as specified in agency instructions. Well, there are HUD instructions that ask that you identify your title of the project as it appears in the action taken by the Congress. More on that momentarily. And you will want to use what I will later refer to as the joint explanatory statement, which oftentimes is little more than the title and a word or phrase that indicates the use of your grant. It is vitally important that you can include that information in this box and then summarize in a sentence that takes that word and explains it in a more of a coherent sentence form that then sets up the complete project narrative that you would attach as a supporting document for box number 15. Then moving on to the last item, which we'll actually come back to in a bit more detail, is box number 21. There are standard assurances related to the submission of your grant package. This first one applies to all grantees, where your certified representative would assure the accuracy of the information as being true and correct to the best of their knowledge, as this states right here. True, complete, and accurate to the best of my knowledge. But there are 2 other possible forms and slightly different statements that need to be made as well, and we'll come back to that shortly. Okay, this next slide describes for you the specific instructions and the three essential pieces of information that you will need to guide the correct completion of that part of your application packet. On the left-hand side is the fillable. The left column shows the SF424, which we've already gone over. I've referred to the instructions, the specific instructions, I should say, in the grant guide. And you see how they are listed in the same fashion according to the box number. And you see, for example, a reference here to number 8, where it's referring to enter the legal name of your organization. I referenced earlier the UEI, that's the unique entity identifier, which you would obtain from SAMS.gov. And if you've not registered your agency with SAMS.gov, you need to do that first so that you can then have the system generated number to then enter into that field, box 8. And then thirdly, the award information from the joint explanatory statement that is referred to as the JES, or the congressional record. Why is that important? Because of the fact that your grant has received special appropriation from Congress, and they are expressing their intent for the use of those funds in that joint explanatory statement. And your application or your proposed use of the funds and access to those funds must tie to that intent of Congress. HUD is obligated under law to follow the intent of Congress. So that's the importance of the center column, or the center of this slide. The right side, the right column, includes the notation I mentioned about the certifications. And I referenced earlier that the box 21 refers to certification and assurances, which will enable your authorized representative to sign, date the form, and provide the assurance and attest that that information in the application is true, complete, and accurate, but also a little more information as well, as indicated on this next slide. After you complete that SF424 form, your authorized representative must make the further assurances that fit the type of project or program your community undertakes with its CPF funding. Depending on the type of the project, you must then download and complete one or both of the above forms, which specify certification of those additional assurances that relate to the type of project you undertake with those federal funds. And you may obtain, by the way, each of these forms as appropriate of where you obtain the SF424 application for federal assistance. What I want to note here is that the first of those supplemental forms is a set of assurances that correspond to non-construction programs. That becomes clear to you as a grantee if I first explain what that second bullet relates to. The SF424D is assurances for construction programs. That's very straightforward. And you know whether or not your project will be funded from the CPF grant and it is a construction project. But if it is more than a construction project, anything else, it triggers the use of this non-construction form, the SF424B, in addition to the SF424D. And when in doubt, we urge you to check with your grant officer to determine which of these two forms, or whether both of them, might apply. I will also note here that HUD is creating an enhanced tool that its grant officers will use in reviewing the packages you submit so that you will receive more details and instructions from your grant officer in regard to elements of this SF 424 and the related forms. Okay, that's it for the first part of our presentation. And before we move on to the other required forms, what questions do we have, if any, Jennifer?
No questions so far in the chat on the material that's been covered.
Okay, all right. Well, you may proceed then with the other required forms. I guess we could check to see, Connor, if any grant officer has joined us who needs to be introduced.
I'm looking, but I don't see anybody right now. So I think our assigned grant officer must have had a last minute conflict.
Okay, all right. Over to you, Jennifer.
Great, thank you. So we have 2 more forms to review, and then that will conclude the list of forms that are required for your submission. So we're going to talk about those 2, and then we're going to talk about the checklist, which is not a form, but is a helpful tool in making sure that you have a quality submission before you send your materials in. So we're going to start with these 2 forms, the SFLLL, which is the Disclosure of Lobbying Activities form, and then we're going to talk about the SF1199A, which is your direct deposit form. So the SFLLL, Disclosure of Lobbying Activities, is a form that is required of all grantees. So even if your organization does not do any lobbying, you still need to complete this form and submit it. What you do to complete it is a lot easier than if you do lobbying. However, even if you don't, again, this form is required of all grantees. So if you are an organization that does not do any lobbying, you're going to go to box 10 and you're going to enter NA in that box, box 10, and then you're going to sign the form and you're going to include it in your package, and that'll complete this form. However, if you do engage in lobbying, you're going to need to complete this form fully. If any funds other than your federally appropriated funds, of course, have been paid or will be paid to any person for influencing or attempting to influence an officer and employee of any agency, a member of Congress, an officer or employee of Congress, or an employee of a member of Congress in connection with this federal grant. So when in doubt, just complete the form. It's better to have this form completed with full disclosure than the alternative. So if you do engage in any lobbying, make sure you're careful about the completion of this form. But if you don't engage in lobbying, you can check box 10 as not applicable and then submit the form with just that information. So the information that you need to submit on the form, you have the grant guide to give you a little more direction on what's required. So on page 13 of the fiscal year 23 CPF grant guide, you can go to that page 13 and see more about what's required for that disclosure of lobbying activities form. There is a link on that page directly to the form on the HUD website. You're going to go to that link and you're going to download the form. This form can be saved and opened in Adobe Reader. So as I said, the form can be saved and opened in Adobe Reader, which means that you can complete this form electronically, which is a good time saving. So you can open that form up, complete it. And again, if you need additional instruction on that form, you can look at page 13 of the grant guide. You can go to the next slide. Okay, So now we're going to talk about the SF 1199A. This is your direct deposit form. So the form that gets you your funds, right? This is where how HUD is going to know where to send your funds when you go to request funds through DRGR. So page 19 of the CPF grant guide is going to give you all of the background information on this particular form. You want to be really careful about the completion of this form, of course, because it is related to your financial access. So make sure that you look at this page 19, because at the bottom of the page, there is a block that will tell you how to complete each of the fields of the form and tell you exactly what kind of information is being requested. There is a link on this page to the form, so you're going to follow that link to access the form. So again, this form can be completed with a computer using Adobe Acrobat. You can complete it electronically. Again, look at page 19 of the grant guide. But just to point out, you're going to need to complete sections 1 and 2 as the grantee, and then your bank or financial institution will complete section 3 of the form. So this is really a two-part process, so plan ahead for that. So you're completing sections 1 and 2 of the form, your bank or financial institution will complete section 3 of the form. It is also requested that you submit a voided check or a deposit slip with this form. If you do not have a check associated with this account or a deposit slip, then your bank can write a letter in lieu of those pieces of documentation, and the letter gets addressed to HUD, and the address for that kind of letter is in the grant guide on page 19. So if you do end up needing your financial institution to put a letter together to meet any of these requirements, then the address is there on page 19. I will also note that at the bottom of this form, SF 1199A, it will say at the bottom that you should mail this form into HUD, but that is actually not what folks would like you to do for this particular grant program. You should just include this in your grant submission to your grant officer. So you're going to email it along with the rest of your materials rather than sending it separately. But once you've reviewed this form and verified all the contents, you want to make sure that you've gone through, checked all of the data, all of the numbers are correct and that sort of thing. And this form, once completed, will be the last form of your package. Yeah. So,
Jennifer, before we continue, we do have a few questions that we should probably address, and I will read to you those questions since 2 of the 3 cover what you just went over.
Okay.
One of the questions, or this first is a statement: if our organization is part of a state alliance that employs a lobbyist, would we need to include this information? And I'm presuming that that's referring to, the information on the LLL, the disclosure of lobbying activities.
So for this, I know this won't be very satisfying, but I think you should talk to your grant officer about the specific facts of this case, because the facts of the case might be important in terms of determining whether the form is required in your situation. So I would say go ahead and talk with your grant officer to make that determination. Unless you have a different thought on that, Randall, I'm not sure.
No, I think that's sound advice. And what I think you'll hear us say in regard to each of these forms, when in doubt, it usually makes sense to go ahead and do it. There are certain areas that are so nuanced, it does require a careful examination of the facts, and the grant officer may have to confer with others at the Department of HUD, and that really can potentially cause a delay. And in the time that it would have taken, you to get an answer, you could have probably just completed the form in its entirety. We also have a question related to DRGR, and the person who asked this question, Jennifer, does note that she realizes it's not part of the topic, but the question or the comment is they have one grant that was entered into the DRGR system before this person started a new job. It's been fully dispersed. They have quarterly reporting requirements. What are the quarterly reporting requirements, and what is the best way to handle them for a project that has already been completed? And I realize this is kind of off topic, but you might be able to answer it, or at least indicate when it would be answered.
Yeah, I can give a little background, and then I'll let Connor chime in if I miss anything. But so grants in DRGR require performance reporting. Most grants report on a quarterly cycle. And so your quarterly reporting is required for any activity where you've had any sort of financial progress or accomplishments achieved as part of that activity delivery. And so it sounds like you've already dispersed all your funds, and I'm not sure if that happened in this quarter or if it happened before you and it just wasn't captured in a previous QPR. Sometimes QPRs don't get submitted timely and you have a little catch up to do. So I'm not sure about the timing of your situation, but at a minimum for each activity, you need to report on accomplishments, which you would manually enter. There is a format for that. You'll see when you open the QPR, it will let you know which activities are required for reporting. It will give you the fields that need to be completed for the reporting. And then any activity that's had financial progress, that is all automatically kind of compiled inside DRGR for you. You don't have to do anything in that respect. But certainly, if your grant's been fully dispersed, unless it happened in this quarter, there should have been reporting previously. If all of that reporting has been done and now you're just seeing these QPRs popping up because the quarters are moving on, that's because there hasn't been a closeout of the grant yet. And so I will leave that timing to Connor to share with us in terms of like what grant closeout might look like for grants. But either the reporting has already happened or it needs to happen. So you're gonna have to look in DRGR to see which it is. And I think, yeah.
And I can jump into so I do want to be clear too. It's not clear to me by the question whether or not this, I guess I'm assuming that this is a CPF award that is essentially drawn down and not another HUD grant that's like entitlement, like CDBG or home or something. So if that's the case, you should reach out to whatever HUD rep that you're interacting with for that specific award. If this is for a CPF award, you do have to keep doing and filling out the performance reports until the award is formally closed out. Our office is currently working on doing and finalizing a closeout process for those awards that have been fully drawn down and you've completed all your activities and you're good to end it. But it is kind of at a weird point because we haven't finalized that process yet. And in order for you to not to finally end the performance reports from occurring, the award essentially has to be formally closed out in DRGR. So that is something that we need to do on our end. And we will keep all of our grantees posted too once we finalize that guidance and start actually walking all you grantees through the process of the final grant closeout. But until then, keep doing the performance reports as they come up in DRGR. Make sure you're doing them by the due dates. And if you have any questions about this, you can of course let your grant officer know and just make them aware too that you're ready to close out the award, everything is completed, and that you're just waiting on our office to close it out.
Yeah, and I would say, Connor, if this happens to be a CPF grant, and that's a great point. I just assumed that it is. But if it is a CPF grant that they've fully drawn and they need to keep doing those performance reports to, to stay current with the requirements. But if it's fully drawn, there's no progress. So would it be
Yeah.
okay in the overall performance narrative to just say our grant is fully dispersed, no additional
Yeah.
information to report this quarter? Is that enough? Just that, a couple sentences in the overall
Yep.
progress narrative?
Yeah, essentially that's what we would require. And again, you can your grant officer may want you to say something more like specific or pointed in the narrative just to help them keep track of the status of your grant. But generally, yeah, I mean, if your report, if your award is closed out, you've drawn down all your funds, you're ready to report on accomplishments, there's simply nothing further for you to report. So you would just say, hey, we're ready to wrap up and we're just waiting on the Congressional Grants Division to close out our award. And a lot of the financial reporting in DRGR, the performance reports are directly tied to your financial information that's tied to your action plan. So that stuff should all be synced. So your financial reporting information should just be in sync with DRGR, and you shouldn't have to mess with that or indicate anything different for those sections. Yeah, but I would recommend I would recommend that you contact your grant officer and just say, hey, by the way, we're looking to close out once Congressional Grants Division is ready to give us that guidance.
And Connor, your added explanation was very helpful. We do have one additional question, and it covers a matter that I actually went over in the first earlier topic on the standard forms, Jennifer, so I'll take it. It asks, if our project includes design and construction, would we be required to complete both the SF424B and SF424D? And I think the answer is probably yes. Here again, we would urge you to check with your grant officer. We don't have complete information on your project narrative and what the project entails in its entirety. But given that you have said the project includes activities other than just construction, it's possible that design and the expenditure of CPF grant funds on the design would make it necessary to include the additional certification form. I would welcome, Connor offering any guidance here. Again, it's one of those situations, like Jennifer said, where we don't know all the facts of the case, but maybe Connor, you can elaborate.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, in this case, it's not. There's not really a downside aside from your time of filling out both assurances in this case. So obviously, if you know that you're going to be doing construction, you need to fill out the construction assurance. But if you have other activities that are not construction that that you think go beyond construction, then I don't think there's a downside in just filling out the SF424B and the SF424D and then submitting to your grant officer. They don't take too much time to fill out, I don't think so. If you're unsure, you can always just submit both.
All right. That's it, Jennifer.
Okay, great. So we can go back to our slide presentation. The next topic is the submission checklist. And as I mentioned, this is not a form, but this is a tool that you can use to make sure that you have a quality submission of your materials when you do send them in. So on this checklist, you're going to see a series of items that are things that we've talked about before in the cohort series and items like forms. This checklist is in the grant guide, so you can go ahead to the grant guide and find it there. The use of this checklist is optional, but it is recommended because, as I said, it will help you ensure that you've met all the compliance requirements for your submission. So on this form, we are going to look at this list and see that the first item on the list is that the grantee has an active registration in sam.gov. And Randall had mentioned earlier sam.gov and ensuring that your organization is registered at sam.gov. So if you have not done that yet, make sure that you have. This is just a reminder. The next item is to double check that your legal name and the funding amounts are the same on your SF 424 forms as they are in the JES. You also want to check that the SF 424 forms, the SFLLL, and of course the 1099A, that all of them are completed accurately and signed. Make sure that they're all signed before you send them in. And then the project narrative, we had a whole cohort session on the project narrative. So if you need a refresher on that, those materials all are available on the HUD Exchange. You can go back, listen to the recordings, access the slides and the transcripts. But you want to make sure that your narrative is descriptive enough to describe your entire project, and make sure that it covers the specific activities that will be funded with your CPF grant. Similarly, with your project budget, you want to make sure that it contains all the key requirements. Again, that cohort session that you hopefully attended as part of this cohort series is on the HUD Exchange. If you didn't get to attend it, you can listen to the recording and look at the transcript and the slides on the HUD Exchange to make sure that you're including all of the key requirements and complying with the 2 CFR Part 200 requirements that are related to the budget. And then finally, there on this checklist, there are items related to direct cost. So indirect costs. So indirect costs is a concept that was covered in the budget cohort session. You can go there to hear a little bit more about these indirect costs, which are those costs that are applicable to this grant, but could be applicable to other things that you're doing. And so there's actually a lot of resources available on indirect costs. We didn't even go into all of it in the budget session, but in the budget session slides, there are additional links and resources to indirect cost guidance that you can review if you have questions related to indirect costs. But basically, this little checklist is asking if you're going to use the default rate for indirect costs or if you have a separate federally negotiated indirect cost rate. And so those are the items on the checklist. As you can see, it's not very long, but by going through this, it'll make sure that you've addressed some of the common things that end up causing a rejection of the submission packages. And that checklist is on page 41 of the grant guide. So again, this is not a fillable form. This is not even a form. It is just a tool. And so if you go to page 41 of the grant guide, you're going to see that checklist there, and you can print it off, use a pencil to check things off, just go through the list in your brain, use Adobe to highlight things. However, it is helpful to you, but it is there as a tool that can improve the quality of your submission. All right, so some of these things we've gone over already. Just to let you know though, we talked about submissions early on in today's session, wondering when y'all might be submitting those materials to HUD. And so just a reminder here in this last bullet that the application materials should be submitted by email to your grant officer directly, and then also to the CPF grants at HUD.gov mailbox. You can go to the next slide. Cover those other things there. And it's time
Yes, okay, it's time
exercise.
for another poll, right? And it's actually, as Jennifer indicated, an exercise or an activity. I would like to set up an example of a grant award that illustrates what you as a typical grantee would ideally do with this grantee submission checklist. First, the grantee's representative, yourself or others in your office, would assemble all the necessary materials referenced on the checklist that Jennifer just went over. And then you would determine that they're either complete but maybe thoughtfully check all the boxes but a few. It's often the case that you might be unsure about certain of those items. And we're going to illustrate this point with an example of a grantee we're calling ABC Supportive Housing. And what I'd now like to do is ask Jennifer's help in dropping into the chat the one-page description of the activity. And if I don't see it drop in there, she might have stepped away. I will.
Oh, no, it's there. I just dropped
There
it.
it is. Okay. Okay, good. And I'm going to share that same document. You are welcome to open it up and kind of read along with me. And I will try to stress the points that are of particular importance in correctly answering questions about this particular case. Again, the name of the project is ABC Supportive Housing, and the project number is B-23, which means this grantee is in the same class as your grants. It's, of course, a CP grant, and in the place of these two X's would be your state, two-letter abbreviation, and then an assigned number. We're going to look at three parts of what would be your assembled materials. And of course, these are illustrative. They're examples of what would be included and extracted from much more extensive documents, but that's the project narrative, the joint explanatory statement, or the so-called JES, and then the grantee submission checklist that Jennifer just went over, which has been completed in part by the representative, who's then thoughtfully considering whether to check off the highlighted items. I'll come back to those items in a moment, but first, let's read what is the part of the description that would probably appear on both the SF424 in box 15 with a brief phrase and a title of the project, and then further be supported by an attachment to that SF424 that elaborates on what the project narrative is. And we're summarizing here what would appear presumably on the SF424 box 15 for the project title, and then the instructions to begin describing that project and the use of funds. The ABC Housing Project will provide housing and services to residents with special needs. Residents will receive drug and alcohol rehabilitation services. The agency is also renovating an apartment building as part of their project, and they are expanding its operation with support from the United Way. And then this simply says the project is made possible in part by a $1 million CPF grant to ABC Housing Services Incorporated. That is the project narrative and the project title and summary statement on the SF424. Now, what does the joint explanatory statement say that this grantee representative, this representative of ABC Supportive Housing has located and is among the materials that he or she is reviewing to complete this checklist? Well, this is an example of how the congressional record looks. It appears in respect to these awards of special congressional appropriations in a table, a tabular form of pages and pages of grant awards. We see just 3 here, including ABC Supportive Housing Services. And that project title, ABC Supportive Housing Services, indicates part of that joint explanatory statement. You see, it's not what we learned in grade school of a subject and a verb. It's just a phrase that indicates this is the project title, and it's a project that involves services. And the grantee is correctly related to what's in the narrative, ABC Housing Services Incorporated. So that part checks out. And of course, the state would appear here. And then it's for a $1 million amount. You note that there are 2 other entries that are shown here just to illustrate how brief these JES items are. Bertram Gardens refers to land acquisition. Capital City is a job placement program. And you see for the different amounts and those grantees' names. But what we want to focus on here is ABC Supportive Housing Services, and then the grantee name as well as the amount of $1 million. So we then look further at the grantee submission checklist that the ABC Supportive Housing Inc.'s representative has completed. And they've checked off all but 3 of the items on the list that Jennifer went over. And not surprisingly, those 3 are among those that Jennifer did highlight in some detail. The second one here relates to the legal name of the funding recipient in the SF 424's Block 8 is the same as the entity named in the JES, or a technical correction of that act of Congress. And remember, she pointed out, as I did too, that Block 8 is the applicant information. So they would be asking themselves at ABC Housing Services, well, can we check this off? Does our legal name appear on the SF 424, the application for federal assistance, using the same identity as named in the JES, which is like what appears above. And so if we look at what I told you would be the content of the SF 424 in a different part, let's presume that it actually says in the applicant name, ABC Housing Services Incorporated. Does that align with ABC Housing Services in the joint explanatory statement? The next item that the representative has thoughtfully considered is those supplemental forms. They know to have completed the SF 424, and it's been completed, properly executed, and dated. But should they have completed the SF 424B, which you remember is for non-construction? Is it required, and should it be similarly properly executed and dated? And then the third uncertainty relates to the project narrative. Here, they are wondering, is our project narrative describing the entire project, and does it indicate in that narrative, in any related information, the specific use of the CPF grant funds? This item specifies that ABC Supportive Housing should indicate the specific activities that will be financed with the CPF funds. They do describe activities, but did they specify what of those activities would be financed with the CPF funds? And I'll scroll back up here in case you don't have the document opened. We're referring particularly to this statement or paragraph here. Does it particularly specify the activities that will be financed with the CPF funds? So pretend for the moment that you are the representative of ABC Supportive Housing, and we will now launch the poll where you will actually answer questions related to this very matter. And I'm going to go back to the presentation now and note the same slide that references the poll. And Jennifer, you can launch poll 2. And here you see the 3 questions. And we would like for you to answer yes or no if you were the representative of ABC Housing Services. Is your agency correctly named on all the legal documents, the grant materials, the congressional record or JES, and so forth? And then the second question is that form, the SF424 assurances for non-construction, required of your housing/services project, yes or no? And then the third question is, do you describe the whole project in detail and the uses of the grant? And take your time and feel free to look at the one-page document, the ABC Housing Services project narrative that and the other details that appear on that PDF file. If it would help you better answer the question and determine if you were working for that nonprofit organization, would you check off those boxes and then proceed to submit your grant packet to HUD for approval? Looks like we only have 14 of the 44 participants. Is that what you're reading, Jennifer?
Yes, that's what I see too. Sorry, I had to get myself off mute. It's going up now. We're at 16, it looks like.
I like the fact that this group of participants are thoughtfully considering the answers to the question, because this is part of the guidance that we are strongly interested in you to completely understand, to grasp and apply to your own projects, so that you're more likely to submit what HUD is expecting and not find that your project is unnecessarily delayed for the grant officer having to ask you for more detail or to correct information that had been submitted. And if you're uncertain of the answers, just hazard a guess, because this is, again, a learning experience, and we're doing this for illustration. We will be discussing the correct answers and momentarily. So it won't hurt if you go ahead and indicate what you're not absolutely certain is the right answer, yes or no. But you think, based upon what you've heard either Jennifer, Connor, or myself say so far, would apply in this instance of ABC's supportive housing project. Jennifer, do you think we should end the poll at this point? We have 64% participation, it seems.
Yeah, I think now's a good time to end it. I'll end it and share the results.
Okay.
So it looks like for question 1, is our agency correctly named on all the legal documents? Folks mostly answered yes. For question 2, is that form, the SF424B, required for our housing/service project? About 76% answered yes. And then for question 3, do we describe the whole project in detail and the uses of the grant? And 64% answered yes.
Okay, well, let's take a look now at the answers as they appear under this larger question. Are you ready to submit as a representative of ABC Housing Services? The first question on this list is related to the agency being correctly named, and the correct answer is yes. Why? Because the name is exactly the same as it appears in the JES and is consistent with the unique entity ID. This one is pretty straightforward, and I think most of you did get that answer correct, and we would have thought that that would be the case. The questions get a little harder as we go down the list, though. Question 2 relates to the form of SF424B being required for their housing services project. And the answer is probably yes, because remember that SF424B form is for non-construction activities. We know that the grant project includes supportive housing services, and as such, those types of public services are a non-construction activity. Therefore, it is likely that the SF424B would be necessary. The third question is maybe the hardest of the three. Do we describe the whole project and the uses of the grant? And what's important to think about here is that last phrase, uses of the grant funds, specifically the CPF grant funds. And I want to go back now and point out to you exactly what that narrative says. I'll stop sharing this screen and we'll look again together at the one pager. And note that the reference to the $1 million, which the intent of Congress is to spend on services, simply says that the project is made possible in part by a $1 million CPF grant to ABC Housing Services, Inc. And ABC Housing Services describes their project as including housing and services, specifically drug and alcohol rehabilitation services. They say the agency is renovating the apartment building as part of the project, and they're expanding their operations and support from the United Way. So there are at least 3 activities here. But which of those 3 activities will use the $1 million CPF grant? It's not really clear. And given that that's the case, the answer to that last question, as we see here, is in fact no. Why? The project narrative does not clearly describe the specific activities for which the CPF grant will be used. That narrative is to include such a delineation And as Jennifer noted earlier and covered in the budget session, the budget should relate to the sources for the grant project, covering not only the CPF grant, but any other sources of funding as well. In fact, they recommend a so-called sources and uses budget that would differentiate between that $1 million and however the nonprofit would renovate the apartment building and without what amount of money they would use from the United Way to expand their operations. So the grantee would only be ready to submit the application after describing the entire project in a clear fashion that aligns with the specific uses of the grant, including a budget with probably sources and uses for both the grant and other aspects of the project. Okay, Jennifer, are there any questions that have come up, or are there any comments that you would like to offer before we move on to the last part of our presentation?
No, there are no new comments or questions in the chat. But thank you all for participating in that exercise. I do think it really helps to illuminate some of the common stumbling blocks that have come up in the application packages.
Yes.
All right. Well, here we are at the end of our cohort session on forms, which means we've reached the end of the line in terms of content topic webinars. And so this is the last session for the content topics. We do have one more session in this series, and that is the office hours session next Tuesday. So if you do have questions after hearing all of this material, perhaps you'll have some time over the next week to take a look at the forms and consider how you would complete the forms, and maybe that will raise some questions. You can bring those questions to the office hour session next Tuesday. That session, you can bring other questions as well, but the topic of the day will be forms. So at the end of that session next week, that will formally conclude the cohort series. And we can go to the next slide. And there you go. There's the day and time for the next session, next Tuesday, the 26th at 2 p.m. So you want to have that on your calendars so that you can come, even if you don't have questions. This whole cohort series has been a wonderful peer learning opportunity. So other folks may have questions that will help you gain a better understanding of the process. If you want to reach out to either Randall or myself, you can do that. Our email addresses are there on the screen at tdainc.org. And then you've seen this slide probably about 4 times now, maybe more. But I think it's worth repeating that these resources are really, really helpful in your preparation of your grant materials, as well as the implementation of your grant. So if for some reason you're still not sure who your grant officer is, you can find the assignments on the HUD.gov website. We talk a lot about the HUD Exchange because most of the materials and resources for the program do live on the HUD Exchange, but this particular resource is on HUD.gov. So the link for that is there. Of course, the CPF program website on the HUD Exchange is where all of the resources are, the grant guide that we've talked so much about throughout this series, as well as some desk guides and some videos for DRGR. And there'll be more and more information and guidance materials rolling out as the program moves forward. If you need to reach an environmental officer, the contacts for the environmental officers are at the link that you see here at the HUD Exchange. And then, of course, we have this wonderful resource of the AAQ, so the Ask a Question pool, where you can submit your CPF specific questions. And you can do that after this cohort series wraps up. It is there as an existing resource long beyond the cohorts. So anytime you have a question related to CPF, if you're not sure where to go with the question, you can submit it through the AAQ. But again, just another plug for your grant officers. Always try to reach out to them as well. And then finally, of course, we would love your feedback. We'd love you to complete this evaluation. If you have your phone handy and can grab that QR code there, it will open the survey directly and you can complete the evaluation for this particular session. We ask for an evaluation on each session. Our team at the Cohorts mailbox will be sending out this link. So if you are not able to complete it just right now, you will get a link so that you can do that as a follow-up. So keep an eye out for the cohorts at tdainc.org email with the survey link. And that concludes our session for today. I'm just taking the chat one last time. Nothing new there.
Yes, I don't see any additional questions.
Yeah,
But
so
we do hope
you.
that you will attend the office hours next week.
Absolutely. We'll see you there.
All right.
Thank y'all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.